It is the dawn of the 20th century. Tension is rising in Europe. Alliance is crucial. A war is coming. It is a European war, but it's going to be a world war. If the war breaks out, it is going to lead to a global conflict. Powers involved has large overseas empires, so the colonies would be a crucial strategic factor. The combatants would also strike at each other's colonies, spreading the war far more widely than previous European wars. The First World War started on July 28, 1914, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and the two existing military rivals, the Central Power, who are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Ottoman, versus the Allied powers, Britain, France, and Russia, choosing sides. Since most of these powers control many overseas territories, these territories are going to be involved. The combatants would strike at each other's colonies and find human and material resources needed for prosecution of the war. When Africa was divided among European powers at the Berlin Conference of 1886, there was an agreement between Europeans that in case a conflict arise in Europe, their colonies in Africa would be neutral. Therefore, at the outbreak of the war, none of them had plans to challenge their opponents for control of overseas colonies. There was also a publication by East African Standard that states that they should not fight each other but rather focus on the repression of the indigenous people. Reasons for this agreement include the fact that many of their conquests in Africa was recent and not yet solid, considering some little resistance going on, and the fact that many of their forces had been moved back home when the war started. Alas, it was an agreement to be short-lived. On the 5th of August, 1914, a day after Britain joined the war, they saw the need to have control of the sea, especially with the use of local forces. This is because the Imperial German Navy commerce raiders had been in a trade war, fighting against Allied trades on the sea, blocking supplies which could be used later in the war. This prompted the elimination of German vessels in the sea. To achieve this, the coaling stations where the German ships sourced for coal to power their ships and their wireless communication station in Africa has to be destroyed. These were all at Lüderitz Bay, Windhoek in Namibia, Douala in Cameroon, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and German wireless station in Togoland. All of these were German colonies and were going to be the root of a series of war campaigns to be fought on African soil, which is going to involve West, East, and Southern Africa. In West Africa, the campaign to destroy the German wireless station in the Togo was launched by both the French and British colonial forces. Togo was invaded on the 6th of August by French forces from Dahomey to the east, and on 9th of August by British forces from Gold Coast to the west. The battle for Togo went on and ended on the 26th of August, 20 days after it began. The French and British were victorious, and the colony was later shared between both of them. France received most of it, and Britain took the part that became Volta region of Ghana today. The Cameroon campaign began on August 25th, just about the time the Togo campaign ended, and it began with the invasion of Cameroon by British forces from Nigeria, while the French and Belgian forces joined the campaign on another front, outnumbering German Schutztruppen forces 5-1. After a series of attacks and counterattacks, the war spilled into Nigeria in 1915, when Captain von Krailsheim from Garua conducted an offensive into the eastern part of the country. The attack was quickly repelled in a battle known as the Battle of Gurin. The war continued in Cameroon and lasted for 18 months before the Germans and their families escaped to the neutral Spanish colony of Rio Muni in Equatorial Guinea, leaving the British and French in control. The campaign ended in December 1915 in Southwest Africa. By September 1914, British troops tried to invade Namibia from South Africa, but they suffered a serious defeat. Only few survivors returned to South Africa. The war spread into South Africa the following year, when German soldiers invaded part of South Africa in order to prevent another attack on their colony, but the attack was repelled by the South African Union Defense Force. By the end of February, South African Prime Minister Louis Botha had built up an army and ready for second invasion of the German Namibia. They invaded it and gradually captured all of it. By the 9th of July 1915, the remaining Germans surrendered. In East Africa, at the onset of the campaign, the German colonial forces called Schutztruppen were numbered 2,760, which were mostly Africans, while the King's African Rifle were 2,319. This includes Africans from British East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, and Nyasaland. The first strike was on the 5th of August when British troops attacked German outposts near Lake Victoria. The war went on through series of attacks and counterattacks till November. In early November, Indian Expeditionary Force B and C of 8,000 and 4,000 men, respectively, arrived in the east coast of Africa, outnumbering the German forces. Although the Germans became outnumbered 8-1 at Tanga and 4-1 at Longido, the Schutztruppe under Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck defeated the British offensive. In the United Kingdom's official history of the Great War, Charles Hordern recounts the operation as one of the most notable failures in British military history. The victory was a significant achievement for the Germans, as it delayed the British invasion of German East Africa for almost a year and a half. The battle resumed in January 1915 at the Battle of Jassine, where German forces attacked British forces stationed at Jassine, close to Tanga. At the Battle of Mahiwa, October 1917, 3 Nigerian battalion forces joined the British with plans to take on the Germans on one side, while King's African Rifles and South African Regiment attacked from the other side and round up the German Schutztruppe. The Germans as well brought up reinforcements from their colonies and divided themselves against the two British sides. After several days of continuous fighting, the Nigerian battalions were surrounded and suffered heavy casualties. On the other front of the war as well, the British forces withdrew after suffering devastating losses. The battle lasted for 4 days, and the Germans had expended over 850,000 rounds, inflicting around 2,700 casualties on its enemy, while it suffered 519 casualties. Since it is now limited on supplies, it decided to withdraw from its colony and launch an invasion of Portuguese East Africa, where it hoped to regain strength by capturing supplies from the ill-prepared Portuguese army there. The invasion of Portuguese East Africa, which is today known as Mozambique, was swift and successful. They returned after 9 months, sometime in August 1918. On the 13th of November the same year, the Germans took a village in Zambia, and on the following day, the German commander, Lettow-Vorbeck, was handed a telegram which stated that the war had ended in Europe 3 days ago. This puts an end to the East African campaign of the war. The war marked the end of the German colonial empire in Africa, as the German colonies were divided between France, Britain, Belgium, Portugal, and South Africa in the Treaty of Versailles. In terms of casualties, the East Campaign alone saw the death of over 3,000 British soldiers killed in action, 6,000 died of diseases, and 95,000 deaths among Africans who are mostly porters, according to Strachan. In the West Africa Campaign, 927 British casualties, 906 French casualties, and 1,322 casualties from recruited African soldiers. 574 porters out of 20,000 from the colonies were killed or died of disease, and many more permanently wounded. In another record of Pace in 1989, he states that 350,000 lives were lost on both sides. To get the support of Africans, Allied powers posed as crusaders for liberalism and enlightenment. But Africans didn't buy that to some extent because the war made the colonial masters create new laws and policies which had adverse effects on the society. In East Africa, about 1 million people were conscripted to serve as carriers, which caused depopulation and led to famine in 1917 to 1918, which resulted to thousands of more deaths. In the West, British government in Nigeria increased its tax and other fees, which led to the Adabi War in Egba in 1918. About 600 people died, including British agent and a king called Osalem. There was also Chilembwe uprising in Nyasaland, now Malawi, in 1915. As British was galvanizing support of the locals for the war, a Christian leader called Chilembwe campaigned against it, giving his people reasons why they should stay away, which includes the forced labor and racial discrimination they've been subjected to, and the property and human rights they've withheld from the people. This resulted into clashes in January 1915, which led to the death of 40 people, including the Christian leader. In November 1915, a large anti-French uprising broke out among the tribes in the regions of present-day Mali and Burkina Faso. The reasons for the discontent came from the forced military recruitment of soldiers. These regions were subjected to significant recruitment of colonial troops to serve on the front lines of the First World War. The last resistance was suppressed in September 1916. During the suppression of the uprising, over 100 villages were destroyed by French colonial troops. In the German colonies, carriers used by the Germans were rarely paid, and food and cattle were stolen from civilians. A famine eventually broke out due to the continuous food shortage in 1917. This led to another 300,000 civilian deaths in Rwanda, Burundi, and German East Africa. Few Cameroonians were favored by the Germans, including Chief of the Bedi people, who moved to Madrid where they lived as visiting nobility on German funds. There was also an internal rebellion among the Cameroonians, where the locals became victims of atrocities such as sexual violence. In one event, numerous killings were committed by German forces, especially in Djibouti, where a white commander reportedly gave the order to kill every native they saw. Close to the end of the war, the Spanish flu reached East and Southern Africa, which resulted in over 500,000 deaths. In conclusion, an estimate of over 1.5 million people died as a direct or indirect result of the war. Because Europeans had to call back their soldiers to Europe at the beginning of the war, they had to rely on colonial soldiers. These includes the West African Frontier Force, WAF, King's Africa Rifle, KAR, Force Publique, FP, Senegalese Tirailleurs, and Schutztruppe. They serve in various theaters of the war in Africa. Meanwhile, the Senegalese Tirailleurs, in a force called the Congolese Volunteer Corps Service, extended beyond Africa. Firstly, it's important to note that talking about Senegalese Tirailleurs, they consist of African soldiers from various French colonies, and they are not limited to people from Senegal alone, although most of them came from Senegal. They had a size of around 200,000 during World War I. Aside of Africa, this Senegalese tirailleur saw action in Europe as well, with around 135,000 of them serving in Europe during the war. They fought with distinction in France during the Battle of Flanders in late 1914, at the Battle of Verdun, in the recapture of Fort de Douaumont in October 1916, during the Battle of Chemin des Dames in April 1917, and at the Battle of Reims in 1918. Losses were particularly heavy in Flanders, with an estimate of 3,200 to 4,800 deaths, and Chemin des Dames 7,000 out of 15,500 who engaged. 7 battalions also saw action in Dardanelles, Turkey, and then Macedonia. There was a practice called hivernage. This practice in the French army is the withdrawing of sub-Saharan African colonial troops, particularly tirailleurs, from colder theaters of the war to overwinter in warmer climates. This started in 1915, and it happens between November and March of each year. During this period, they camp majorly in Fréjus and Courneuve. This is necessary to prevent them from dying of cold-related diseases. However, about 40,000 of them had to share the camp in Courneuve, which was built for 27,000 of them. Therefore, the troops had to endure inadequate shelter, insufficient food, and extreme temperature. Over 1,200 of them died of pneumonia between 1916 and 1917. The site where they were buried is designated as a national necropolis by the French decree of the 23rd of May, 1993. At the end of the war, when the armistice of November 11, 1918 was signed, it was in the agreement that the German territory of Rhineland should be occupied by the victors. This was deemed important in order to give France and Belgium some security against any future German attack, and also to serve as a guarantee for Germany's reparation obligations. Germany and his allies were required to pay 132 billion gold marks. This occupation was overseen by the French, and over 25,000 colonial troops took part in the exercise, which ended in 1930. Although no hard evidence was produced, campaigners claimed that the colonial soldiers, the Senegalese in particular, were responsible for a substantial number of rapes and sexual assaults. Children resulting from these unions were stigmatized as Rhineland bastards under the Nazi regime. The occupation was considered a black plague, and the children as well as their mothers were declared non-German by the writer of the book, The Black Shame, a novel of disgraced Germany. Aside from the Rhinelands, there were other black mixed population between 20,000 to 25,000 who were results of affairs between German officers who served in German colonies in Africa and in the Melanesia, and the women of the colonies they served in. When they lost the colonies, they had to return with some of their families, while some others, their families came looking for them. In 1933, under law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, a special commission was tasked with preventing procreation and reproduction by Rhineland bastards. Some 800 children of mixed parentage were arrested and sterilized as a result of this. As for the Congolese Volunteer Corps, Pierre Ors, the advisor to the Belgian Minister of the Colonies, Jules Renken, suggested bringing soldiers over from the colony of Congo for deployment. But this idea was dismissed as being bad for the civilization and prestige of the white race in Africa. Reason was that if black people saw the awful conditions in which white people were fighting the war in Europe, they would lose their morals in the Congo colony. But on the 5th of August, 1914, Congolese Volunteers Corps was established by royal decree. They consist of Congo natives who served under Belgium command in Africa and Europe. Besides Africa, the Congolese soldiers fought at every major Belgian battle except for Liège and Halen. Among the Volunteers Corps, there was a Congolese intellectual living in Europe, Paul Panda Farnana by name. After becoming the first Congolese man to receive a higher education diploma in Belgium, he signed up for the Belgian army at the outbreak of the war. Following the end of the war, he set up an association for Congolese war veterans and took an active part in Pan-African activism as a critic of Belgian colonial practices. Most of the Congo veterans who fought in the war settled in the Ixelles district of Brussels, which 40 years later would be rebranded as Matonge in honor of its sizable Congolese population. Some places in Africa served as strategic and military bases for the Allied for the prosecution of the war within and outside Africa. Such bases include Mena Camp in Egypt, near the pyramids where Australian and New Zealand forces camped. In Kenya, there was a British military base which also housed German prisoners of war and some civilians. The Germans had their camps set up at Tabora and Karima. There was also a French camp in Morocco, which is one of the hivernages for the Senegalese tirailleurs. There were many other camps, but this were the major ones which existed for a long time through the war. These aspects of Africa and the history of World War is often overlooked in historicals, movies, and remembrances. However, in recent years, there has been a growing interest in the recognition of the African contribution to the two world wars. Organizations like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission have worked to preserve war cemeteries and memorials across the continent. Brussels, for the first time, paid tribute to the Congolese soldiers of World War I in 2023. Also, monuments were specifically erected for the African soldiers and carriers who fought and died in the campaigns. To fully appreciate the impact of World War I on Africa, it is essential to explore these monuments. By doing so, we can honor the sacrifices of African soldiers. One of these monuments is the Askari Monument in Tanzania. It was unveiled in 1927 in Dar es Salaam. The monument was erected by the British in honor of the King's African Rifles and the Carrier Corps. Another one in Tanzania is the Dar es Salaam British and Indian Memorial, a memorial in Dar es Salaam War Cemetery that honors some 1,530 British and Indian soldiers who died in the East African Campaign of World War I. In Kenya is the Mwashoti Fort Memorial, which is located near the ruins of Mwashoti Fort in Taita Taveta County. The memorial was erected to honor the sacrifices of African soldiers. The fort itself was a strategic location during the conflict, and many soldiers and porters would have passed through, been stationed there, and died there. To mention few, many other memorials, including graves within and outside the continent, exist, and more of them we will discuss in the African history of World War II, because they now also serve as both World War's monuments. Africa's role in World War I is a chapter in history that has long been overlooked. However, the continent's contributions to the war effort were significant. with over 2 million African soldiers and laborers participating in various campaigns. From the battlefields of Africa to the trenches of the Western Front, African soldiers fought bravely, often in harsh conditions and with limited recognition. The war also had a profound impact on the continent, leading to widespread economic disruption, famine, and social change. The experiences of African soldiers during the war helped shape the continent's anti-colonial movements and demands for independence. Today, as we reflect on the centenary of the Great War, it is essential that we remember and honor the sacrifices and contributions of African soldiers and civilians. By acknowledging this forgotten chapter in history, we can work towards a more inclusive and nuanced understanding of the global impact of World War I.
Africa fights for their cause and ours.
Beyond the known narratives of the World War II lies an unfamiliar chapter in the records of history. Africa, a continent often relegated to the peripheral in historical accounts, actually played a pivotal role in the war.
In the jungle, the Japanese just like a snake for hiding back.
From the dusty battlefields of Al Alamein to the lush jungles of Burma.
So many people died, and it was very discouraging.
African soldiers fought valiantly alongside the Allied forces.
My battle jacket soaked in blood. Then I realized that I was in trouble.
Even as African cities and ports served as critical hubs for supplies, refuge, and strategy. In this video, we would delve into the fascinating stories of Africa's contributions to the World War II and celebrate the bravery, resilience, and sacrifice of the Africans. Join us on a journey to rediscover the forgotten history of Africa in World War II. Apart from the general name, the World War II, each major conflicting side has its own term for the war. To the USSR, it was known as the Great Patriotic War. Japan called it the Great East Asia War. And to Europe, it was the European War. It was one of the many wars between Europeans, but with most of Africa under European control during the war, the continent became inevitably entangled in the global conflict. For example, Libya was an Italian colony bordering Egypt where British troops have always been stationed to keep the control of the Suez Canal under Britain. When Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, declared war on Britain and France on the 10th of June 1940, it led to an inevitable military campaigns in North Africa, pitting Italian forces against British and Commonwealth troops, and which was the first involvement of Africa in World War II. This part of the war, referred to as the North Africa Campaign, through series of advancement and retreats, expanded from Libya and Egypt to Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and Chad. Some soldiers from Africa, such as Libyan Arab forces, South Africa, Morocco, and Tunisia, joined the war for their own reasons. For the Libyan Arab forces, the leader, popularly known as Idris of Libya, was fed up with Italy colonizing his territory and viewed the British as a lesser devil, therefore made agreement to be free and independent after the war in exchange for the support of his troops in the North African Campaign. Other Libyans, like the Savari, who were the local colonial troops, fought on the side of the Axis, and about 28,000 of them, fighting on horses, suffered heavy defeat at the Battle of the Marmarica. Tunisia and Morocco, which were both French colonies, took both sides as well. In the case of South Africa, they contributed fighters and assistants under the umbrella of Commonwealth, which included others like India, New Zealand, and Australia. Then also the Native Military Corps. The campaign ended May 1943 with the Axis forces surrendering to the Allied forces in Italy, losing its colonies in Africa. Meanwhile, within the period of the North Africa Campaign, there was a two-day war and conflicts in parts of west of Africa. The major one is called the Battle of Dakar. It happened in September 1940. The Battle of Dakar occurred for this reason. Since the Nazis had seized and is in control of major part of France at the early stage of the war, there were disagreements on who is to hold the control of French West Africa colonies. The Free French, or the Vichy government controlled by the Nazis? West Africa was important to both warring sides in the war. First, the region provided raw materials and supplies for the war, and its ports served as crucial refueling and staging grounds for ships traveling the Atlantic. Second, it's going to be a source of troops' contribution to the war sooner or later. Therefore, it's important to have control of it. The control of French West Africa was automatically in control of the Vichy government since Nazis took over France. Therefore, the Free French forces led by Charles de Gaulle attempted to take control of Dakar, the capital of French West Africa, from the Vichy French government, which was collaborating with the Axis powers, but the Free French ultimately failed. They didn't stop there. There were other minor conflicts they created at Abidjan, Conakry, Senegal, and Gabon till 1943, when they finally defeated the Vichy government in West Africa. On the east of Africa, when Africa was shared among the colonial powers, Somaliland was divided between Italy and Britain. Therefore, we have Italian Somaliland and British Somaliland. When Italy declared war on Britain in June 1940, war did not only break out in the north of Africa, but also in the east. This includes Kenya, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and the colonies of Somaliland. The Italian army invaded the British Somaliland and forced them out of the area through the sea. That was in August 1940 at the Battle of Tugargan, lasting 5 days. In early 1941, the British Army reinforced and recaptured Somalilands and head forward to seize other areas controlled by the Italians. November 1941, Italian East Africa completely came under the control of the Allied forces. In all the mentioned campaigns and some others to be discussed, African soldiers worked as medics, labor units, artillerymen, and as infantry soldiers. They were also grouped into units and divisions, some of which were mainly Africans and others, alongside Europeans. One of such units was the King's African Rifles, formed as far back as 1902 to carry out internal security duties in British East Africa colonies. At the beginning of the Second World War, there were more than 22,000 members in total, and 20,000 of them were Africans, with more recruited later during the war. In the East African Campaign, they fought against the Italians, against the Vichy French government in Madagascar, and part of them Burma. The Savary soldiers. These were Italian colonial troops. They were cavalry soldiers from the Arab Berber population. They fought in the North African Campaign on the side of the Axis power, but suffered heavy defeat at the Battle of the Marmarica. Royal West African Frontier Force was a homogeneous force established at the beginning of colonialism to garrison the British West Africa colonies. People were recruited from West Africa, which includes Nigeria, Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. In 1939, the RWAFF was transferred from the control of the Colonial Office to the War Office, and it saw expansion of its size from 6 to 28 battalions. They served during the Second World War against Italian Somaliland, Abyssinia, and Burma. Native Military Corps. In South Africa, Native Military Corps was created in mid-1940, and it was done to make up for the shortage of white soldiers in the region. Its size was around 80,000 black soldiers from South Africa. They served in Egypt, Libya, Madagascar, and Italy. Senegalese tirailleurs. Senegalese tirailleurs existed as far as 1857. They are French colonial army recruited from Western, Central, and Eastern French colonies, and they fought for French during various wars. During the Second World War, there was around 200,000 active tirailleurs, and some of them were deployed to France. This constituted about 9% of the French army. When talking about African soldiers that were heavy victims of racism during the Second World War, the Senegalese tirailleur might have been number one. As the German forces advances through France during the period, Senegalese tirailleurs and other soldiers from African origin, captured, surrendered, or wounded, were separated from French soldiers and killed. In one event called the Chasselet Massacre, some French soldiers surrendered after exhausting their ammunition. The captors took out about 50 Senegalese tirailleurs among them, executed them, and drove tanks back and forth over their body. Sudan Defense Force formed in 1925, and with about 5,000 Sudanese to support the British Army in the colonial activities. It was expanded in 1940 when Italy joined the World War, numbering up to 20,000 Sudanese natives during the war. To the northwest Libya, to the east Eritrea, Italian Somalia, and the occupied Abyssinia, now Ethiopia. They took part in campaigns against Italy in Eritrea and North Africa. Libyan Arab forces. This is a force that consists majorly of Libyans who sought refuge in Egypt while Italy was colonizing Libya. They were also known as the Senussi Army, and they volunteered to aid the British in the North African campaign. In general, armies from each unit and battalion all served under European officers and had limited chances for promotion. Treatments of African soldiers during World War II are often met with mixed feelings. For example, it is common to hear reports and interviews where the veterans complained about being treated poorly during the war and after. They lamented about racial discrimination, not receiving medal recognition, and other entitlements after the war. There are also few cases of veterans from other units reporting various medals and awards they received and ceremonies held to honor them. This suggests that treatments might have differed from unit to unit. One part of the treatment that is constant is the fact that the war gratuities were generally lower than that of the white colleagues. In fact, 3 times lower. These soldiers were recruited through voluntary and coercive means. People who joined voluntarily were motivated by sense of patriotism and duty. Instances are the Libyan Arab forces and some Ethiopian soldiers whose land were occupied by Italians, while some desire for adventure. They saw military service as an opportunity to contribute to the war effort and potentially travel beyond their home countries. Many of them can be found among the Royal West African Frontier Force. Some found it as an escape from unemployment. Example is the South Africa Native Military Corps, where 52,037 signed up in Transvaal area, where people couldn't farm that year because there was drought. Other areas in the regions with no farming issue contributed between 4,000 and 9,000 men. In cases of coercion, there was something that could be referred to as colonial quotas and chieftaincy system. By this, colonial government of both France and Britain would give a specific number of recruits each parts was to produce. This was implemented in areas like Tanganyika, Uganda, Kenya, and other places. Incentives were given to rulers who met their quotas, and this led to conscription in some places. In 1941, the West African pilot featured a popular statement, "Death knows no color." It is estimated that between 1 to 1.5 million Africans fought in the war. The exact number of African soldiers who died in the war is difficult to pinpoint due to incomplete records and the fragmented nature of colonial archives. However, the estimates range from 50,000 to over 100,000 fatalities according to various sources. At the end of the war, most of the units were scaled down and later disbanded as each country gained independence. The soldiers were used to form the nucleus of the new independent countries. At this point, let's listen to some interviews of the African soldiers who participated in the campaigns.
First of all, we went there. They kill our people. 9 Africa, 2 European. 47 wounded.
47 wounded. 9 Africans, 2 Europeans, and 47 wounded.
So what now happened? You took them back for treatment?
We withdraw.
Okay.
You withdraw.
Okay.
Then make reinforcement.
Okay, you made reinforcement.
Reinforcement.
Okay.
On the Friday night.
Okay.
They say nobody will pass.
Okay. Which is the guy?
For 5 years.
Okay.
Well, we captured them only 3 hours.
3 hours?
Yes.
Is the guy?
From 9 to 12 night.
Okay. In where?
Then Nigeria troop. We second brigade. GKR glucose.
Okay.
Not the Ghana the other time.
Okay.
They call them glucose.
Okay.
Then the first brigade. Then Free Marcher. You will upgrade second brigade to first brigade.
Okay.
The gadget, the Nigeria troop. 1 man shoot 5 every kill one. Then it means that he killed 5 Europeans.
Okay.
Then the following morning, Ara was catch the first West Africa.
Burma, what happened?
What did happen? Japan will take over for first 81st Division. Part of them are West Africa and Gold Coast. Most of them are American troops, Indian troops, British troops.
Okay.
Then as he will take over, I will start fight from Mondon. Get the land of Mondon and beat it down. Canada Valley.
Canada Valley.
Okay, get it from Japan.
Okay.
Akiap will take by first West Africa Infantry Brigade.
Okay.
Then push them to King Doji. King Doji is a heavy battle. But he would unlucky to push them again.
As the darkness of war spread across Europe, thousands of men, women, and children were either forced out of their homelands or fled in search of safety. However, in contrast to the widespread talks of refugees fleeing to the United States or Great Britain during the time, many Europeans also turned to a less likely destination: Africa. From the scorching deserts of North Africa to the lush savannas of East Africa, European refugees found unlikely havens in the colonies of Africa. This section of the video explores the fascinating and often forgotten stories of Europeans who sought refuge in Africa during World War II and their experiences in the course of the war. It is 1939 and Germany had invaded Poland from the west. Few weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded it from the east, and Poland was divided between the two. The Soviet Union forcibly relocated hundreds of thousands of the Polish citizens, their men, women, and children, to labor camps in the Soviet Union. This happened in different waves. Estimates suggest that around 1.5 million citizens of Poland were deported to Soviet labor camps where they faced harsh conditions, forced labor, and high mortality rates. Later during the war, Germany also attacked the Soviets, seizing part of its territories, and since both Germany and Soviets are now adversaries of each other, the Polish government in exile, with the help of the British government, reached an agreement with the Soviets for the release of all Poles. Two categories of people were released: people fit for soldiering and people who are not, which includes women, young children, and the old. This second category of people first moved to Iran as they couldn't return to their homeland because of the war. As time goes on, due to the large population and military situation in Iran, the place was not safe for them anymore. The British government, therefore, helped in relocating them to East and Central Africa. They were hosted in camps in several African colonies, which includes Northern Rhodesia, Uganda, Tanganyika, South Africa, and Southern Rhodesia. An estimate of 20,000 Polish in total. At these camps, thousands of Africans were employed to build the camps for the refugees, and few more were conscripted. Hundreds worked maintaining the camps, fetching water, cutting wood, carrying food, guarding, cooking, and emptying latrines. Other countries that migrated into Africa during that period includes the Greeks, Czechs, and Yugoslavs who fled oppression, famine, and the war. These particular groups occupied mostly Egypt, Ethiopia, and other places depending on how far they could go, while some Jews who escaped persecutions fled to Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, which were under the Vichy government at that time, but they managed to survive. After Italy's surrender in 1943, some Italian soldiers and civilians also seek refuge in Libya and Egypt. Around 50,000 to 60,000 people in total seek refuge in Africa while the war lasted. Refugees in the camps and other locations face numerous challenges, which includes tropical diseases and the psychological trauma of displacement. Despite these hardships, they were able to find safety and stability during the war years. In the heart of Africa and beyond, where the drums of war once beat, lies the graves of heroes who fought for a world they never knew. During World War II, thousands of African soldiers enlisted to fight for the Allies. Few others for the Axis, leaving behind their families, cultures, and homelands. Many never returned, their bodies also laid to rest in foreign soil, far from their ancestral lands. In this part, as we talk about some notable African soldiers who were recognized for various acts of valor in the war, we also pay tributes to the brave African men who sacrificed their lives during the war by briefly exploring the Second World War cemeteries within and outside Africa and memorials that honor their ultimate sacrifice, shedding light on a chapter of history that has been overlooked for far too long. Job Maseko served in the Native Military Corps during the war, where he fought in the North African campaigns. His garrison surrendered to Axis forces at a point during the war. While he was a war prisoner, he sank a German warship loaded with ammunition using a milk can, and the Italians in charge were unable to figure out who did it. He later escaped the prisoners' camp, traveling through the desert for 3 weeks to rejoin another South African division and assisting them to defeat his captors. He was later awarded a military medal for sinking the ship. Another soldier, Barry Ghazi. At a battle in Bardia, many were wounded at the middle of the battle from both sides in the field, and fire was being exchanged. A call was made for someone to volunteer and go to the enemy line with a Red Cross flag to deliver a letter requesting a temporary truce so that both sides can carry their wounded and tend to them. Barry Ghazi volunteered and was able to deliver the letter with a wound in his leg while he was returning. Despite being wounded, he refused to be treated and went back to the battlefield to attend to the wounded soldiers during the period of the truce. As the war went on, he sustained injury in 4 different places on his body inflicted by the explosion of a grenade. Due to this, he couldn't walk, but he used a boat paddle to support himself and kept working. He was awarded a military medal for these acts. Stephen Johannes was a driver, a member of the Cape Corps. At a time during the war, he was transporting 30 German prisoners of war when he lost contact with his convoy due to the dusty weather. Trying to find his way back, he entered a minefield and got the vehicle wheel blown twice by mines. When the vehicle was beyond repair, he had to lead the prisoners out of the mines and guard them throughout the night. At one point during the night, a German prisoner attempted an escape, but he shot him and later led them all to a railway line where he was able to transport them to the camp. Although Stephen's act was regarded, he didn't receive a medal for it. Despite all this bravery and heroism, the gravity of the war cannot be overstated. Somber undertakings and sacrifices were made. Its effects on Africa and Africans are far-reaching and profound economically, politically, and in terms of human lives. An estimated 50,000 to 100,000 Africans died fighting in the war, and they were buried both outside and within the continent. Many cemeteries were also made in different parts of Africa, which hosted fallen heroes from all parts of the world, most of which are being managed by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. For example, in Egypt, El Alamein War Cemetery, which houses up to 7,000 graves, Tobruk War Cemetery in Libya, Majez El Bab War Cemetery in Tunisia. In East Africa, there is Kigali War Cemetery, Addis Ababa War Cemetery, and Dar es Salaam War Cemetery in Tanzania. They are present in West and South Africa as well, like the Accra War Cemetery and the Botswana Military Cemetery in South Africa. It is very important to note that these are just few I'm able to mention, and all these cemeteries includes graves of soldiers from countries like United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, India, France, Poland, Africa itself, and other countries. While bodies of some African World War II veterans were buried in these cemeteries, many others couldn't make it home and were buried outside the continent, especially in Burma, now Myanmar. Aside the cemeteries, special monuments were built in several places, including Africa, to remember those who fought and died in the war. This includes the Remembrance Arcade in Lagos, Soldier Idumota, and World War Cenotaph Lokoja. Africa's involvement in World War II was a pivotal moment in history, marked by both immense sacrifice and significant contributions. As the war ravaged the globe, Africans from diverse backgrounds and countries rallied to support sides of the war. Significantly, the Allied forces, fighting against tyranny and oppression, their bravery and resilience helped shape the war's outcome, while it also laid the groundwork for the continent's eventual decolonization and independence.